Hey everyone, we're about to get started. Can you guys let us know in the comments if you can hear us okay? Hey everyone, we're about to get started. Can you guys let us know in the comments if you can hear us okay?
I should mute that. So yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so this evening we are talking about confronting denial, about historical incidents primarily. And my name is Misty Wilson-Mertens. I'm the chair of the social sciences, and I'm joined tonight by Dr. Leah Darwater.
Hello, I'm a history instructor here at TCC Connect as well.
All right, so first question, what is denial?
Well, denial can come in a few different forms, and maybe we should start with an explanation of how we can get to denial as far as studying history is concerned. We'll start with revisionism, which actually isn't always denial, though most deniers call themselves revisionist. There's a distinction.
So in history, revisionism is a changing of the historical narrative.
Yes.
And most of the time, this is because we have new sources that are available.
Okay. Yes, yeah. So when new sources are revealed, or even when we just kind of move away from the traditional narrative that comes after an event, a lot of times that leads to revision of a source. One really good example of that is the Civil War. There were two main theaters of war where the North and South fought. The Eastern theater was typically fought between the two capitals, between Richmond and DC. And then there's the Western theater that was fought between the Appalachian Mountains typically and the Mississippi River. And during the Civil War, most of the attention was on the Eastern theater because that's where the capitals were. That's where Robert E. Lee was, and he was having a lot of victories. So Southerners paid a lot of attention to the Eastern theater. And so after the war, historians paid a lot of attention to the Eastern theater, and it was credited, that it was the Eastern theater where the Union won the war. But eventually, decades later, historians began to make a shift as they got further removed from kind of the rhetoric that surrounded that, and then really got to looking at sources that revealed that Jefferson Davis sent the generals that he didn't like, that he didn't want to deal with out west. And, that's out west is really where Ulysses S. Grant got started. And it's where William Tecumseh Sherman was, the Union's best generals. And so there became a shift where a good number of Civil War historians now argue that the war was won by the Union and lost by the South in the West, not in the East.
So with revisionism, it's not that the historical facts changed.
Right.
I mean, the battles happened and the same number died on the same day.
And the same people won those battles, the same side. Right. But why?
But we shifted the importance of them.
Absolutely. So the interpretation really is what it is. The interpretation shifts.
So we have a quote here by James McPherson, which if you're all interested in the Civil War, he's one of the historians you should read.
Yes, you should.
And it says, historical revisionism is a term used for the reinterpretation of facts and narratives based on new evidence and sources. It took some negative meaning when revisionists began spinning history in some new directions, pursuing an agenda to cast a different light on some subject or outright create false histories. But for the majority of historical study, revisionism has just been part of the process.
Yeah, it's just revising our study of history. Again, if new sources become available, when we become further removed and it's not so emotional, then history is revised usually as a result of that. But revisionism can be a bad thing, according to your motives, I guess. So another form of revisionism is negationism, and negationism really is extreme revisionism. So this is where facts are chosen to present while they choose to withhold other facts to support their narrative. So pretty much you don't let the facts guide your conclusion. You decide what your conclusion is, and then you pick the sources that support that agenda. So negationism really is cherry picking.
So if I was in like the hard sciences, I would say this is a selection bias.
Yes.
I'm picking the evidence that already.
Yes.
figures what I'm going to say.
Yes, I've already determined what the outcome is. Therefore, I'm only going to use the evidence that supports my theory, what I think happened.
So the next step, if you want to call it that, would be outright denialism. And we should say that not all historians make a distinction between levels 2 and 3. One is not necessarily worse than the other. But for our purposes tonight, we are going to look at this as like a 3rd degree burn.
Yeah.
This is the most extreme you can go. Because this is an intentional distortion of the historical record.
Right.
So not only am I cherry picking facts, I might be changing the facts.
Yes.
Or using sources that aren't verified or discounted, or sometimes even making up sources of my own.
Yeah, definitely using unverified stuff or discounting sources that are verified. One topic that falls in between really would be the lost cause. And so the lost cause really is kind of how Southerners have made amends in their own minds for the cause of the Civil War. And they would say that the Civil War was not fought because of slavery. Slavery was not the cause of the Civil War, and that's not true. I would label this as negationism, not denialism, because they don't deny that the Civil War happened. They don't just deny that it started because the South seceded. They don't deny that slavery existed. However, they are cherry picking the facts that they use, because if you look at the Confederate Constitution, it specifically protects slavery. If you look at the
Declaration of Causes for Texas.
Yes, and then the secession document for South Carolina, they specifically mention slavery as a reason for seceding from the Union. So again, if you go back and you look at the historical record, slavery is the reason that the South seceded, and it was a cause for the war. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the reason that every Southerner fought in the war. Not every Southerner fought to preserve slavery.
Just like not every Northerner fought to free the slaves.
Absolutely. But I think a lot of times people have a hard time wrapping their brains around the distinction for why they fought and what caused the war. And so that's why after the war, there became a goal to preserve the Southern legacy by saying that the war wasn't actually about slavery, but it was. So again, that would be negationism, not denialism. And that's kind of where the distinction is. It's a very fine line, but it's not outright denial.
Denialism for me might be negationism for somebody else, point. Depending on how we're approaching the subject or what we're looking at.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So we should say pretty clearly that we believe and we want students to be skeptical.
Yeah, skepticism is good.
So if I present you with something, don't outright believe it just because I presented it to you.
Yes. Yeah, you should always ask questions and have a healthy amount of skepticism. All historians do, all scholars do. They're not going to take the stuff given to them at face value. They're going to ask questions about it. Well, we'll get into how to be skeptical about it later.
Yes.
But it is good to be skeptical and ask more questions.
All right. So why do people engage in denialism?
Well, I guess really there's a few reasons. I think the first one would be an inability to come to terms with history. So there have been some horrific events in world history, and I think sometimes it's just kind of hard to wrap your brain around it. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the second one. We don't want to believe that human nature is that bad. And so it makes it a little bit hard to come to grips with some of the bad or some of the worst events in world history.
Well, and I think sometimes too, just the complexity of everything involved, sometimes it's easier to just simplify the story.
Yes, and say it didn't happen.
And if you boil it down too much, that's where you end up.
Absolutely.
I mean, again, it's a fine line, right?
It is a fine line.
Don't want to cross it. And then lastly, personal bias.
Yeah, personal biases definitely fall into play. National guilt, and I would say that kind of goes, with the lost cause. Human beings were held in bondage. You don't want to think that your ancestor fought in a war that was started over that. So national guilt, and then racism can play a part in that as well, which we'll see with the Holocaust and with Japan here in a minute.
So we're starting to look at two very specific examples. And so first we're going to look at Japan and the attack on Nanking. And I just want to tell you guys right now, I'm not going to show you any pictures. If you want to go look at pictures of this, they're online. They're easy to find. I would encourage you not to, but use your own personal judgment there. So Nanking was a capital in China in the 1930s. And so this is one of the economic centers. And right before the official start of World War II, Japan invaded China. So this took place in 1937, and it lasted for about 6 weeks. It's really, really hard to get at the exact number of people killed here, but somewhere in the range of 200 to 300,000 people died during the attack. And then we have between 20 and 80,000 sexual assaults. And I will just quickly mention the youngest people sexually assaulted were children, and the oldest people were in their 80s.
Yeah,
so
it's brutal.
Very brutal. This attack was outside of what we consider the usual bounds of war. A lot of World War II was outside of the usual bounds of war, but this is one example. And what you're seeing there as far as the picture goes is part of the monument that's been put in place marking this massacre. So immediately after this happens, or even during the time that it's happening, we start to see the historical record forming about this attack. So we have eyewitness accounts from various point of views. We have Germans who are allied with the Japanese that are recording this. We have American Red Cross workers. We have obviously Chinese and Japanese participants and victims that are leaving their records. In addition to that, we have photographs that are taken by the Japanese and the German participants. So early on, we have evidence that this is happening. We can go back and look at the eyewitness accounts, and generally, they agree on what happened, the basic sequence of events. Anytime you have eyewitnesses, there's going to be some discrepancy. And there's some people saying, oh, this happened on Thursday, and other people say, no, it's happening on Wednesday. But the general narrative is basically the same. In addition to all of that, we also have news reports, including those printed in Western newspapers. So not just newspapers in China, not just newspapers in Japan. And what you're seeing is the New York Times, and you can see one article has been highlighted for you. So this is getting out. This was not a secret at the time.
Right. The rest of the world was beginning to hear about it.
Absolutely. So when denialism starts to take place, it comes in waves in Japan. So during the war, there is a complete and total cover-up for Japanese civilians. Civilians are not told what's happening at the front line, really at any part of the war. And then in 1946, immediately after the war, we have war crime trials. And this is the same thing that happens in the Holocaust. Right. So the historical evidence is laid out, the physical evidence is laid out. You have testimonies that are given, and these are actually held in Nanking. And just on the spelling here, depending on what source you look at and what time period, it's either Nanjing or Nanking.
Yes.
Both are exactly correct.
Yes.
Just depends. In the 1950s and 60s, there's an open acknowledgement in Japan of the attack, what happened and how brutal it was. We have several memoirs that are published, but we don't have professional historical accounts published yet. And that's going to be a problem here in a minute. In the 1970s, we start to see denialism. And maybe this begins as revisionism, but then crosses that line.
Right.
So there's a dispute over the number killed, how brutal the attack was, the tactics of war. And then by the 90s, we have a complete denial of the attack. Now, this is not to say that every Japanese person denies that this happened. This is to say that certain people in the government of Japan deny that it happened. And I have two quotes there given, both by pretty prominent Japanese leaders. One saying that this is a story that the Chinese made up, it's a lie, and the other saying the massacre never occurred. So at that point, we then have historians jump in the mix. And the picture you're seeing there is from Iris Chang's The Rape of Nanking. This is the first historical work on this topic. She goes and looks at survivor accounts, she interviews people that she can find, and she publishes the first narrative of what happened. This is going to set off a bunch of counter revisionism in Japan, saying how her book is wrong, that it's a bunch of lies. But this is an ongoing debate. So since 1989, really when that revisionism in Japan started happening, other countries started contributing monuments and public histories so that what happened in Nanjing and in the rest of World War II in the Pacific Theater would not be forgotten. What you're looking at here is an American monument.
Oh, wow.
And you have 3 women who are depicted as victims and the grandmother who is supposed to be justice for the survivors, that their story is not forgotten. We have now had numerous accounts that are translated and published across the world. And this in Japan has become more of a political issue than anything else. I mean, if you look at the historical record, and if you look at the acknowledgement Japan has made over years and years and years of war crimes committed, then what we see is the denial really scores you points only in domestic politics within Japan. So this has become a way for them to tell their own story, but they keep it within their country.
So in Japan, you typically see politicians denying?
Yes. It's typically politicians that are denying it.
That's interesting.
One way that China has been confronting this is that they encourage people not to go as tourists to Japan so that they're not spreading tourism dollars there.
Oh, yeah.
Because they want a full reckoning before those wounds are completely mended and healed. So this is one example of how denialism occurs. And we'll talk about like wrapping this whole thing up in a minute.
Right.
But we want you guys to have both examples so you can see fully what we're talking about.
Right. So there's another example, which y'all are
basically the same time period.
Yes, definitely the exact same time period, but on the other side of the world, in Europe, in Germany specifically, and that would be the Holocaust. Hopefully, y'all have heard of it. So then the question is, what is the Holocaust? And before I tell you what the Holocaust is, I want to show you some statistics because there's a lot of people who don't know what it is. This graphic is of people in the world, okay, and it was actually based upon a survey from 2014, so about 5 years ago. But 54% of the respondents had heard of the Holocaust. So that means that 46% had not heard of the Holocaust, right? And
that's just heard of, not describe it.
Right. Well, that's a great point. And then if you look at the one below that, it says have heard and believe it has been accurately described by history. Only 33% believed that it was accurately described. So among those who had heard of it, 32% believed it was either a myth or has been greatly exaggerated, okay? So you can see that across the world, there are a good number of people who either haven't heard of it or who don't believe that it's been told accurately. You can see the breakdown by region to the right there. But now kind of making a shift to here in the United States, millennials have been surveyed, and then adults in general. And 22% of millennials and 11% of the adult population in general have not heard of the Holocaust. Okay, and so that's a decent number of millennials. But then 66% of millennials and 41% of adults can't identify what Auschwitz is. And this was one of the main concentration camps built by Nazi Germany. So in case you fall into that group of not knowing, the Holocaust is the systematic and state-sponsored murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime. The Nazis were in control of Germany leading up to and during World War II. Total, they killed 12 million people. And so 6 million of them were Jews.
Outside of warfare.
Outside of war. Yes, that's a great point. Like systematically murdering them in concentration camps. And so in addition to Jews, they would target
the Roma, the Gypsy, the disabled,
homosexuals,
Socialist Democrats. I know I'm forgetting at least a couple.
Anyone Soviets. Aiding the Jews. Yeah, Soviets.
Collaborators.
Yes. Anyone aiding the Jews. So they also murdered Christians if they were helping Jews to escape. And then Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp. It was actually built in Nazi-controlled Poland. And this is where they killed 1.1 million Jews. Okay. So that's why it's important that you would know what Auschwitz is, and the Holocaust. This was an extremely important event in world history.
And we should say that just real quick, Auschwitz is not in the middle of nowhere. It's on a train line.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that even at the time it was super well hidden that nobody would have known about it because to get people there, they had to have the train line.
That's a good point. And actually, if you look at the pictures below, on the left side of the screen, you see two little boys with a yellow, you can't tell it's yellow, but it's a yellow star on their shirt. And that's the Star of David. And that is what would identify Jews in Germany, or in any German-controlled territory. And then you see trains, and those are Jews lined up to get in those train cars, and they are actually being sent to Auschwitz. And so that was a good point about on the train lines. So they're going to load them in these train cars and ship them over. And then that last picture is men who were there at that concentration camp. You can tell that they're pretty much skeletons with skin on them by this point, because they're starving.
Yeah, I've read somewhere that some people were existing on like 300 calories a day towards the end of the war.
Wow.
Which is just nothing.
Yeah, it is just nothing. Crazy to imagine. Okay, so the origins of the Holocaust denial, I mean, this is really going to begin before the war is over with the Nazis themselves. The Nazis were the first deniers. And they sought to leave as little record as possible. In fact,
at the end of the war.
Yes, at the end of the war. But even during it, they would use code.
Yes.
For their killing orders. So they would use neutral sounding words. So the word action would mean a violent operation against Jewish civilians. Resettlement to the east meant forced deportation of Jewish civilians to killing centers in Poland. And then special treatment would mean killing. So even in the beginning, even in the early stages, they tried to make the record so that it wasn't obvious as to what they were doing. And then when it became clear that things weren't going so well, Himmler, who was over the SS, ordered the destruction of camp records, and the destruction of gas chambers, crematoria, really any signs of mass destruction of human beings. He even forced prisoners to dig up mass graves so that they could cremate the bodies, so that human remains wouldn't exist as evidence against what they were doing. He worried about still having Jews alive, so they actually increased the killing towards the end because
they doubled production. That's what the code was.
Doubled production. So that there wouldn't be Jews around to tell, to be eyewitnesses to what had happened. So clearly they knew what they were doing was wrong, and they were trying to hide the record. So they're going to really be the first deniers by trying to hide the record themselves. Oh, and then right after the war, they are going to begin to try to rewrite what's happened. I mean, they began to put, former Nazi officers and SS members begin to write their own stories and publish them, and really their propaganda denying what had happened. So they really are going to start the denying of the war. Here, can you switch? That one is actually out of order. Sorry.
Oh, go one more.
Yeah, and then you can go back to that one in a second. Okay, so a couple of deniers that were not part of the Nazi regime. How would you say? How would you say this guy's name again?
Paul Rainier?
Yes, Paul
Raisonnier.
Raisonnier. He's really going to be the first European writer that's outside of Germany who is going to be an outspoken denier. What's interesting about him is that he had actually been a political prisoner at one of the concentration camps, Buchenwald. Buchenwald?
Birkenwald.
Oh, see, that is not how the person on YouTube pronounced it. But this
all good historians should get their information. It's the pronunciation. You have to listen to it to be able to read the German.
And I don't speak German, so I'll just default.
We speak Texan.
Yeah, I do. That's what I always tell my Texas history students. I speak Texan. So at this concentration camp, there weren't. It was not a death camp. And so there were no gas chambers. So after the war, he hears stories of gas chambers and the final solution where, all of these millions of Jews were killed. And he responds by saying, I was there and there were no gas chambers. And he really is going to pave the way for future deniers. He has a 30-year career of denying the Holocaust with three main arguments. And this becomes really tenets of denial. which is, while some atrocities were committed by the Germans, they have been greatly exaggerated. He also says the Germans were not the perpetrators of these atrocities. The inmates who ran the camps instigated them. So it was the Jews killing all of the Jews, he would say. And he denies that gas chambers and concentration camps, he denies that the gas chambers existed in concentration camps. And he denies the widely accepted figure of 6 million Jews exterminated, okay? And he and a lot of deniers would say that this figure of 6 million is a myth perpetrated by Zionists, those who are pro-Jew and pro-state of Israel, as part of a massive Jewish, Soviet, and Allied conspiracy. And the conspiracy is to swindle Germany out of war reparations. Okay, so this is just a big conspiracy that has been created by the Jews. And I was reading something that says really what they seek to do is take the Jews from being the victims, and they essentially make them superhuman to where they can create this huge worldwide conspiracy just to get Germany. And then there are going to be lots of deniers in between, some of them even academic historians, which is a real big head scratcher, some Americans as well. And then on the right, you have a guy by the name of David Irving. And Irving is really probably the most famous Holocaust denier. And that's because he liked to get his name out there a whole lot.
Yes.
And so
he sought publicity.
He did. He would interrupt other people's press conferences just so that he could get attention. Irving is from England. And he actually wrote lots of books about World War II. He is not a historian, but he is a historical writer. He writes about history. And the reason I say he's not a historian is because he is not academically trained. He did not go to college and learn how to study history. But he's written about history. And in the late 1970s, he published a biography about Hitler. And he said that his goal was to clean away the, quote, years of grime and discoloration from the facade of a silent and forbidding monument, end quote, to reveal the real Hitler. He believed Hitler had been slandered by historians. And so what he was doing was attempting to write a biography through the eyes of Hitler, all right? So early on, he actually doesn't argue that the Holocaust didn't happen. Instead, he claimed that Hitler did not know it was happening. So he actually likes Hitler, has good things to say about Hitler, says he's a good leader, and he knows nothing about the Holocaust. Instead, that Heinrich Himmler orchestrated the whole event. So really what's going to happen is he's going to go from being a sloppy revisionist to an outright denier. And that all happens he tried to create a political party. When that fell through and he was out of politics, then he started outright denying the Holocaust. So let's move back to that one
and we should say there's an audience for that. So he was making some money doing this.
That's a great point. Irving made millions off of being a Holocaust denier. And so that's why I would put him as one of the leading ones, because he really did make millions off of publishing these books about World War II that shed a positive light on Nazi Germany and on Hitler. So there's definitely an audience for this. And it's also why it's important when we're going to talk about at the end to kind of verify your facts and stuff. Because before he became an outright denier,
you could have said he was a revisionist.
You could have said he was a revisionist, and people really bought into that. Okay, so why deny the Holocaust? Why are these people doing this? Well, the biggest reason, the first thing that stands out is to attack the legitimacy of the state of Israel. They don't like that Israel is a country now. And so by denying the Holocaust ever happened, then you are denying the reason that they got Israel to begin with. And so so that's the first reason. Some of them for profit, and Irving, that is certainly the case. So again, there is some money to be made in that for some people. There are political and ideological motivations. There's a desire to see the resurgence of Nazi racism. Neo-Nazis today, definitely, that's one reason to deny the Holocaust. But the one thing that all Holocaust deniers have in common is that they're motivated by anti-Semitism, which essentially is racism against Jewish people. Okay, so they are anti-Semites, and ultimately that's why they deny the Holocaust, because it's a group that they hate so much, therefore it could not have happened to them, right? Okay, so then let's talk about how on earth could you possibly deny that the Holocaust ever happened when you're talking about millions of people who are dead? How can you deny that?
Well, and photographs.
And photographs and eyewitness accounts. Yes, yeah. So how do you deny that ever happened? And the first thing that they do is they manipulate sources. They change things, they change dates, they change who was at meetings. So they manipulate the sources. They ignore obvious facts. What a lot of them typically do is when confronted with evidence that counters what they're saying, they just completely discount it. They ignore it. They won't engage you in conversation about it. They just say that it's not real.
So this is beyond cherry picking.
Beyond cherry picking.
For sure, just straight up denialism.
Yes, because those are verified documents that they are discounting and saying aren't real. They minimize the dimensions of genocide. As I pointed out, they say that the 6 million is a myth. And then they trivialize and they rationalize it, claiming, you know what, this is an acceptable thing because it happened in wartime. The Jews were the enemy, therefore they killed their enemy, and that's just what happens in war. One of the big things that they do in the midst of all of that is they deny that the gas chambers ever existed, because if they negate the gas chambers, or if they can prove that the gas chambers didn't exist, then they really negate the means for mass murder. So if the gas chambers didn't happen, there's no way that they could have killed that many people.
Because that's one of the cornerstones of the Holocaust research.
Right, absolutely.
So if you remove that, the whole thing comes tumbling down.
Yes, it implodes. And so that's why they really try to prove that the gas chambers didn't exist, except they'll never be able to prove it because they did exist. So let's see. It's fake news. All right.
We're reading y'all's comments.
Yeah, sorry. You
Y'all
distracted
made us
me.
laugh for a second. With
train of thought has now been broken. Thanks for that. All right. So that's pretty much how they deny the Holocaust. So let's move on to, can we call her the heroine in this story?
You know, this is such an interesting story. It really is.
Yeah, it really is.
Historians don't get to be public very often, and we don't get to win a lot.
A movie written about them. Yes, no, you're so right. And so this is Deborah Lipstadt, and she is a professor of history at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. So she's an American historian who writes about the Holocaust. And she ended up writing a book really confronting this denial of the Holocaust. The book is Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory. And it was published in 1993. And in this book, she actually specifically mentions David Irving.
That was about the time he was getting really, really famous.
Yes. And she says, she's like, I maybe dedicated 300 words in the entire book to him. So it's not like she harps on him. But she did call him one of the most dangerous spokespersons for Holocaust denial. And he really took issue with that. And what's really interesting is that he took issue with being called a Holocaust denier because he was very open and in your face about it and was very public about it. But he didn't like her description of him because it would mean that he was not a reputable historian. And that hurt his brand. And so what he does is he actually files a lawsuit against her and her publisher. And he sues them in England because in England, so he's suing her for slander. And so if he sued her in the United States, he would have had to have proven that what she said about him was untrue. But because he sued her in England, she had to actually prove that it was true.
Right. The libel laws are reversed.
Yes. And so, so they went to trial, and she said what she didn't want to do is put the Holocaust on trial. So that's not what they did. Instead, they put Irving's work on trial. And so they actually got the books that he had written. They looked at the footnotes, and then they went back to the sources that he cited in his works. And what they found is that he had changed dates. He had changed sequences of events. He had relied on unreliable witnesses. And like one person said something that was contrary to everything else that had been said, but he only listened to that one person. So he pretty much distorted the evidence or gave half-truths. And so what's going to happen is that she is going to win, And not only does the judge rule that he is a Holocaust denier, the judge also rules that he is a racist and an anti-Semite, which that part makes me laugh.
That's an amazing headline.
I know, except that he's not a historian. Yeah, I know, right? So it's pretty bad when you sue somebody and then the verdict is you're a racist.
Not only are you wrong.
Yeah, not only are you wrong, but you are also a racist. And so he loses this, and she says that this, it's not going to end Holocaust denial. Of course, she, anybody with a brain is going to know that, but she says it unravels their case because most Holocaust deniers cite him.
Right.
They cite what he's been saying, or they cite the same sources that he's citing, and those have now been found to be untrue, and he has been found to be a liar. And so that really unravels their case for denying the Holocaust. Okay, so now that we know that he lost that case, how do we know that the Holocaust actually happened? Because, that's important right now, right? Because I'm saying that the Holocaust deniers are wrong. So how do we know that the Holocaust actually happened? Y'all, the Holocaust is the best documented case of genocide that we
started genocide studies.
Yes.
There had been genocides before this.
Right.
But now it's a formal field of study.
Yes. Yeah. And it started because of the Holocaust, and it's so well documented. We have survivor accounts. So we're talking about Jews who survived these concentration camps. We have their accounts.
Liberator accounts.
Liberator accounts. The soldiers, Allied soldiers, some of them American, who liberated these concentration camps. We have their testimony. We have the testimony of Nazis themselves who claim that all of this is true. We have pictures. We have Nazi records. And in fact, the Nazi record, a lot of those came out in the Nuremberg trial, which happened shortly after the war ended. And 3,000 tons of records were introduced at the Nuremberg trial. And this is Nazi records. They kept really good records. You were telling me.
So all of the prisoners in the camps
Yes.
were given a number.
Yes,
and it was
that's tattooed on their arms. Mm-hmm.
And roll call was done 3 times a day. So if you're tracking a particular prisoner,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you can even know the hour that they died.
Wow.
If it's in the roll call record.
So they kept really good records.
Mhm.
And so based upon the records, we know it's true. And then, of course, there's physical evidence as well. So we have a lot of evidence that the Holocaust did, in fact, happen. And that denial of it is ridiculous. But if you don't believe all of that evidence, let's just take a look at the words of some of the leaders of Nazi Germany. Hitler himself said, "Today I want to be a prophet once more. If international Jewish financiers inside and outside of Europe should succeed once more in plunging nations into another world war, the consequence will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and therefore the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe." So Bolsheviks, he's talking about that was the result of World War I. The communists, the Bolsheviks take over Russia. He says that in 1939. So that's leading up to
Mm-hmm.
the final solution where they start killing the Jews. So he's saying if we end up in a war, it's going to end up in the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And so that's exactly what he set out to do. And then Himmler said, and I'm pretty sure this quote was in 1943, he said, and he's talking to some leaders, some SS leaders, and he says, "I also want to talk with you quite frankly on a very grave matter. Among yourselves, it should be mentioned quite frankly, and yet we will never speak of it publicly." They only spoke about this among the high-ranking officers. He says, "I mean the clearing out of the Jews, the extermination of the Jewish race." So we have the words of 2 of the highest rank. Himmler was really the second most powerful person in the Nazi regime, just after Hitler. And so you have the 2 most powerful men in Nazi Germany saying, we're going to annihilate the Jewish race, or we're exterminating the Jewish race. So we have the words of them as well.
Our thing broke.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, well, we have one more slide that's not showing up for whatever reason, but we wanted to talk to y'all about how to verify information, because here's the thing. We can tell you this all day long, that Holocaust deniers are wrong, that the politicians in Japan who are denying the rape of Nanking, that they're wrong because the historical record supports it. But you need to know how to verify this stuff as well.
Well, and these are two really big and fairly easy to prove examples.
Absolutely. And they're not all that big.
And so, there's a lot of little details in history that we want you guys to be able to verify if you ever had to.
Absolutely.
So first off, we're always going to tell you, every historian's going to tell you, find scholarly sources. So find sources that are written by professionally trained academics. You can look outside of history. You can look to other disciplines.
Yep.
But, if you're writing a historical paper, start with historians.
Yes, that makes sense.
You should look for sources that contradict each other, because in that debate between them, you'll find some truth. And then primary sources. You have to go to primary sources.
So this is the original documents from the time period in which the event happened.
So letters, photographs,
eyewitness accounts,
diaries, news footage, if it's a modern.
Yeah, government documents. So all of that's important to look at. Check the bibliography of your sources. So if it's an academic or if it's a scholarly source, they are going to footnote all of their sources. So you just have to look in their footnotes and you know where they got that information from. So it's very important to check the bibliography and to know where they're getting their information from.
The other thing you can do is Google the author.
Yeah.
Because if you're reading David Irving, or if you're watching one of his speeches, he sounds convincing.
Right, and his books do, and he has footnotes.
Yes. And so, you could be reading this and think, oh, this guy's legit.
Yeah, Hitler was a great guy. Who knew?
So Google the name and see what comes up. Yeah.
That he had an agenda, which was to prove Hitler was a good guy, but he wasn't.
You can also image search for photographs.
Yeah.
So photographs can be now pretty easily photoshopped or changed. So go into Google, right-click an image, search Google for the image, and you can see where that image is from and who's using it for what.
Yes.
And this is also something that's great to do with modern news stories.
Yes.
Because a lot of times they'll show you a president signing a bill, and they'll tell you it's for one thing, and it's completely different.
Before you share a picture on Facebook, please do this. I see people do that all the time, and I'm like, no. And then bias confirmation. Check your own bias. As you're reading this stuff, are you only reading stuff that agrees with, the way you think? And then check the bias of your source. All historians are biased in their own ways based upon the time period we live in, our upbringing, our worldview. Now, we do our best to check them, but they influence who we are and how we study history. And so you have to be aware of that. And so, again, it goes back to researching the author. You can learn through researching them what their bias might be and look for that in their writing.
So, for example, if I am reading a historian that only writes about military, only writes and studies from the military point of view, and then they're telling me about the social aspect of what's happening, I might want to go find a social historian just to make sure that they're correct.
That they match up. Absolutely.
Yes. And then the last thing is you need to be clear that you're researching the interpretation of what happened, but we're not debating facts. So if you get into an article where they're trying to completely rewrite the facts of history, that should be a red flag.
Yeah, that's a big red flag.
Because facts are generally well agreed upon. We can argue over interpretation, but it's really hard to argue over fact. And the best example of that is Columbus.
Yes.
Columbus, 1492.
Sailed the ocean blue.
Now, I can change my perspective if I look from Columbus's point of view or from Isabella's point of view or from the Native Americans' point of view. They're all different.
Right.
But 1492, it happened.
Yeah.
That's the
There's
fact
no
of the matter.
changing that.
Exactly. So we want to open this up and see if you guys have any questions for us.
Ask away.
And then if you guys are thinking of questions, we'll talk real quick about how you're going to get credit for attending this. So guys, as you know, this is our last Learn to Discern webinar in our series. We made it.
Sad.
It's the end of the semester. We survived. If you've done a couple of these, you know how it goes. Give us about 5 minutes after we close the webinar out, and then come back and reload the page, and you'll see a link to a Google survey. Fill it out and make sure that you give us your professor's name, the course you're in,
please,
and the section number.
Yes.
That greatly, greatly helps us.
Yeah.
Answer all the questions, and then that's how you get credit. We leave those up for 48 hours. And then after that, ask your professors about how
Yeah.
to get credit for that.
Yes. One thing that I want to say that I did forget to say about the denial of the Holocaust is, if you notice, for the Rape of Nanking, it's Japan's government that's denying it. Germany's government does not deny the Holocaust happened. And in fact, it is illegal in Germany to deny that the Holocaust happened. And it is in multiple.
And they've arrested people.
And they have. And there are multiple countries in Europe where that is illegal. Now,
because they consider it such a danger to the social welfare.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Deborah Lipstadt would say that's not, she disagrees with those laws because of free speech, but of course she's an American. So
that First Amendment's bred into us pretty early.
Yeah, definitely. But so I just wanted to point out that this is one of those cases where the government itself acknowledges it and actually squelches any denial within their country if they can help it. I'm going to let you take that question.
All right. So Lacey asks, would the modern day comparison of denial be 9/11? That's absolutely one of them, but by far it's not the only one.
Yeah, but definitely one where there is a ton of evidence, and yet people still want to deny it, often based upon their own biases.
The invasion of Iraq is another one, the most recent invasion of Iraq.
Yeah.
The Vietnam War has a lot of shades of revisionism to outright denial in it.
It does, absolutely.
So, I mean, really, any event can get there, which is why it's really important to be well-read. So that when you have an outlier in the sources, you can pick it out.
And know that it'd be very skeptical of that one. Yes.
Any other questions?
I think that's it. That's all I see.
All right. Well, thank you guys for making time for this. And we hope you will tune in next semester. We don't know what the series is going to be yet, but there will be one.
We'll see.
So we will keep everybody updated. And we will see y'all next semester in the fall. Thank you.